to welcome once again and good morning. Day two of the 2025 OE Arizona Conference. My name is Matthew Bloom. I'm English faculty at Scottsdale Community College and the OER specialist there. I'm also past president of the OE Arizona Board of Cultivators, and I'm personally very excited and humbled to see the engagement and participation from around the state and beyond as we now see this conference completing its seventh consecutive year. It's crazy to think that, but it's true since Maricopa hosted the first Arizona Regional OER Conference in 2019. I just want to give a special shout out to Chelsea, James, and everyone at Pima Community College for taking on the hosting role this year and next. And thank you to everyone on the conference planning team as well. Now, while I recognize that you're all joining us this morning from locations across the state and from other parts of the country, I want to take a moment to share the land acknowledgement statement of Scottsdale Community College, where I'm based. So Scottsdale Community College credits the diverse indigenous people still connected to the land on which we gather. Our college resides on the ancient lands of the Huhugum, ancestors of the Olatham, and tribal territory of the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. SRP-MIC is a federally recognized tribe, one of 22 Arizona indigenous tribes, and one of 574 across the United States. Attached to this physical space is a painful history of forced removal and the resulting intentional genocide of its indigenous people. We remain appreciative of our ability to teach, learn, and serve in a space of such importance and reverence. SCC acknowledges the land on which we are situated today as the traditional land and home of two distinct tribal nations, the Ankh-Akimel O'otham, Pima, and the Halichiram Pipach, Maricopa. We take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land, the Huhugum. We offer our respect to all O'otham and Pipach of the past, present, and the future. And before we proceed, we also want to reiterate that we are able to offer this conference free of registration costs thanks to our generous institutional sponsors. First of all, Pima Community College, and then Maricopa Community Colleges, Arizona State University Library, Yavapai College, University of Arizona Foundation, Northern Arizona University Klein Library, and the University of Arizona Global Campus. So today, actually, we have Dr. Blake Naughton, Vice Provost of Academic Affairs, Teaching and Learning for Online Initiatives at the University of Arizona, to tell us a little about the program at University of Arizona Global Campus. Dr. Naughton leads the academic affairs team and faculty within the University of Arizona Global Campus across the areas of faculty affairs, academic programming, innovation, and operations. In this role, he helps to ensure student success through excellence in online programs. Dr. Naughton has over 25 years of teaching, research, and leadership experience in education, government, and nonprofit sectors, with a focus on expanding educational opportunities and engaged scholarship. So thank you for joining us today. Dr. Naughton, take it away.
Thank you, Professor Bloom. I appreciate that nice introduction. And thank you to everyone, not just our great panelists and our hosts, Pima and Maricopa. I really appreciate all the work that you do to put these things together, but also everyone who's taken time to participate in these things. We have a variety of other pulls in our time in higher education, particularly now. And so that we're stepping back for the sole purpose of making conditions better for our students is a boon to what the outcomes are for what we're trying to achieve. You know, my introduction there was about my career is around expanding access, and at its core, that's why I've been excited about OER for years now, and worked in that space in a couple of different institutions. I've only been in Arizona for less than a year now. So I'm excited about this work and excited to learn more about the OER Arizona community, and I'm thankful for this conference. I'm very excited that University of Arizona Global Campus could be a co-sponsor, and we're very happy to bring that to this meeting today, because this is part and parcel to our mission. Our purpose in the global campus through online modalities is to reach students that we wouldn't otherwise reach, and to find new and innovative ways to do that. And obviously, open educational resources is a critical piece of that. Many of you may or may not know that the global campus has, for a long time, had its own publishing arm. It's a unit we call Constellation, where we create multimedia course text and materials that go in our online courses, and those are also available for other institutions to use as well. And as we try to create a business model that will help us to sustain creating great educational resources, our teams have an eye toward what OER means for that and how we can continue to develop and partner and privilege the opportunity to have open resources embedded in our courses. And frankly, we are like many publishers that we're working at cross purposes to a business model, which has always been about revenue and always have been about the bottom line. But how do we recognize that's not our mission? Revenue helps us to achieve our mission, but that's not the core parts. And we're really proud of our teams that are developing text and thinking about OER. I'm proud of our faculty that are leading the way in our institution, folks like Professor Teresa Handy and others that care about open educational resources and are partnering with this organization to create more and more opportunities for embedding this in this special instance that we do, which is asynchronous online learning, but in all the different ways that we can partner to do that. So I want to thank everyone again for being a part of it today, and it's a privilege to help be a co-sponsor for this. And if there's other ways that our institution could be a stronger partner as we build that out, we're happy to help be a piece of that. So thanks so much, and I hope you will have a great day 2 of the conference.
Thank you so much, Dr. Naughton, for those words. We also would like to invite John Doherty and Peter Runge from Northern Arizona University to say a few words about what's going on with open education up north.
Thank you, Matthew. As you said, my name is John Doherty. I am Head of Research and Instruction Services at Klein Library, and joining me is my colleague, Peter Runge, the Head of Special Collections and Archives, also at Klein Library. And as Dr. Naughton also said, we are privileged to be co-sponsoring OER Arizona again this year. We've been part of this network for a while now, and it's been a place where we've learned as we ourselves have explored our own affordable learning materials initiatives. Our moderator today has been one of our gurus, Cheryl, and we've always depended on the OER Arizona network to help us figure out some of our own challenges as we move forward with it. On behalf of our dean, our provost, and our president, we are welcoming you to the conference. We have an administration at NAU that's very much invested in our open education initiatives and in our affordable learning initiatives, to the tune of actually funding us over the last few years. When administration funds us, I'm sorry, Dr. Naughton, when we get the funding, we always know, oh my God, they've actually put some skin in the game here. And you'll hear a little bit this afternoon from some of our faculty who we've actually used some of that funding to actually develop and OER both for their courses and for their colleagues. NEU's mission is, in many ways, we are access to excellence. We have an initiative where any family in Arizona that's earning less than $65,000 a year can send their graduated high school students to NEU with free tuition. So we're really focused on reducing costs. And so far to date, with our traditional or orthodox OER initiatives, we have saved somewhere in the region in the last 2 to 3 years. We're looking at around about $2 million of savings to students alone. And that's very exciting to us. And I did say traditional orthodox because I'd like to hand it off to Peter. Peter can also talk about another major initiative that we are doing as well around OER.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. As John and Professor Bloom said, my name is Peter Runge. I'm the Head of Special Collections and Archives here at the Klein Library on the campus of Northern Arizona University. And what we want to share with you today is that in 2022, our president, Dr. Cruz Rivera, was awarded a $10 million grant that was jointly funded by the Mellon Foundation and Northern Arizona University's Foundation. The project that was funded is called the 7 Generation Signature Initiative, and it's designed to indigenize the curriculum and campus of Northern Arizona University. Klein Library, Special Collections and Archives are excited to be part of that project, and the part that we are responsible for is developing an Indigenous open educational resource repository. Later today, we're going to hear from one of John and my colleagues, Moana Loma Mbaya, our archivist for Indigenous Initiatives and Cultures, who's going to discuss and talk about the development of the IOER and the future of the IOER on campus. And we're excited to share that. It's relatively new. It's a relatively new concept in the OER context. And so we are excited not only to share our progress, but to hear feedback, questions, and other information from all of you. So I just want to thank everybody for attending today and giving us the opportunity to share what we're doing here at Northern Arizona University.
Well, thank you very much for your support and all of the great work that you're doing up there in Flagstaff and around the state, everyone. So yeah, this is the 7 years that we've done the OER Arizona conference, and I think this is the first time that we ever had a prize drawing. So without I guess further ado, I guess what I'd like to say is we've got so before we introduce the keynote speaker for today, this prize drawing, anyone who attended yesterday's keynote has been entered into this wheel that I believe Chelsea is going to be operating here. Here she comes. All right. So,
yep,
let's do it.
All right. So the first prize that we're going to give out is for a voucher to the Open Ed conference. It'll be a virtual voucher. And if you do end up, whoever wins it ends up attending, I think we can probably transfer it to somebody at your institution. So, all right, here we go.
This is pretty cool. Free registration, free virtual registration to the Open Ed conference in October.
So Amanda Dixon.
Woohoo!
And if Amanda Dixon is not here, I will reach out. And then we have two other gift cards and to the bookshop. So you can purchase a book of your choice. So, all right. So, Shellis Kleinman. Congratulations. And I'll spin it one more time. Donna Neeson. All right.
Well,
Congratulations.
all right. Yeah, congratulations.
Yeah, can I also mention we will have some prizes on the leaderboard. If you go to the Whova app and you play some of the games or make comments or share your resources, and the top two winners on the leaderboard will also win a prize. And we will have another wheel this afternoon at our awards ceremony at, I believe it's at 4 o'clock or so, to win some more prizes. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you, Chelsea, for that, and everyone who put that together. That's pretty cool that we were able to do that this year. And yeah, it says, at least I have it in our little script here, that there will be another prize drawing at 3:55 at our OER Awards, OER Arizona Awards ceremony this afternoon and closing remarks. So please join us then, not just for your chance to win, but also to kind of close out the conference on a positive note. So without further delay, and we are actually we're running about 15 minutes early here. So I think what I would like to do is just say that, you know, the OER Arizona conference, and you know, John Doherty from NAU just spoke earlier and talked about Cheryl Casey being kind of the guru that helped guide some of the stuff that they've been doing to develop their program there. And for those of you who are in attendance today and maybe don't know a whole lot about like where OE Arizona came from or what it's all about, I figured since we have a little bit extra time and to try to stay on schedule, I can provide like maybe a couple minutes of that history. In 2018, so this goes back even before we had our first Arizona Regional OER conference. In 2018, and even several years before that, the Maricopa Millions Project, which was Maricopa Community College's kind of like district-wide open educational resources and low-cost, no-cost resources initiative, we had done kind of annual dialogue days where we were inviting, people who were kind of prominent in the open education space nationally to come talk to Maricopa faculty about different topics related to open educational resources. And around that time, 2016-ish, I had also started to meet some folks who were into open education, but at other institutions across Arizona. And I thought it was pretty interesting because actually this goes back to maybe 2014, I guess, but I was at the Open Education Conference in Washington, D.C. It was the first time that I attended Open Ed. And by the way, if you haven't gone to that conference, it's fantastic. And I happened to, it was one of the first conferences I ever attended professionally. And at lunch one day, they had tables set up with like topics on them. And I wasn't really aware of what the process was. And I just happened to sit down with my lunch at a random table. And it turned out that it was a table of librarians. And I'm not a librarian, so I wasn't supposed to be there. But it also just turned out serendipitously that sitting right across from me at the table was none other than Cheryl Casey, whom I'd never met. But at that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, you're from University of Arizona. I'm from, Maricopa. And it was like, we had to go to Washington, D.C. in order to connect when it came to open education. And I just thought that was, crazy, whatever. So between that and a few other, kind of personal informal connections that I and some others in, Maricopa and other folks that I knew were making, and the fact that we were doing these kind of annual dialogue days, inviting faculty from Maricopa to come attend, we started thinking, well, why don't we invite people from outside of Maricopa to come to our events as well? So in 2018, we invited Rajiv Jangiani from, he was at the time at Kwantlen Polytechnic, which is also in British Columbia, like our keynote speaker. And he came and spoke, and we invited folks from ASU, NAU, U of A, and that was kind of the beginning. It was like this, event at Paradise Valley Community College, and I don't remember, there were probably about 100 people there. And it was very energizing. And afterwards, we kind of talked together a little bit, and we decided, and actually it was Debbie Baker who's here today as well. Thank you, Debbie, for this idea. But the idea was next year, let's make this a statewide conference. And so that was the kind of the birth of the idea of the 2019 Arizona Regional OER Conference. And at that conference, we decided that the second day of the conference, we were going to do a half-day leadership summit to invite some of these people that were in this informal network to come together and kind of talk about what we could do to strategize, staying connected, and that kind of thing. And so, yeah, that was it. It was February of 2019. Maybe it was the beginning of March. I can't remember. But we basically got together on a Saturday morning and ate breakfast and talked about what we wanted OER to look like across the state of Arizona, and the concept of OER Arizona was born. And now 7 years later, we have this conference that is, it's OER Arizona is a formalized network. We have a board, we have institutional partners or institutional representatives from all of the institutions of higher learning across the state and at least one tribal college. And it's just really exciting to see how much growth has happened there. And it's like watching a child grow up, and you're like, okay, well, I guess it's out of my hands now. So anyway, so yes, thank you again. It's really super exciting to have been part of this, and thank you to all of the people who were involved in the process, the long process through the whole thing. So anyway, there I was able to say my little piece about OER Arizona. We're still running a little bit early, but I think that we might as well, I guess, get started with our keynote. So getting back to my introduction here. So Without further delay, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Kayla Lar Son is Metis Ukrainian and originally from Treaty 6 territory. Currently, she is the acting head librarian for the Keynote Library and Indigenous Programs and Services Librarian for the University of British Columbia Library Vancouver campus. So I'd like all of the attendees and participants today to join me in welcoming Kayla Lar Son to speak. Take it away.
Great. Thank you very much. And thanks for having me this morning. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy to hear also that a colleague from KPU has already presented at this conference, and it's great to have discussions on a global context about open education, and especially I think this is a great way to start off today, since you'll be hearing about a OER initiative and repository that focuses around Indigenous initiatives and collecting Indigenous OERs. So I'm just going to share my screen, and I am going to give a warning. It is early in the morning here at Huihua, and what ends up sometimes happening is our building is underground. I'm currently in a contemporary interpretation of a kukuli or a pit house, and my office is the most underground. So when students come on campus and all log into the Wi-Fi, sometimes it crashes our computers here in the branch. But if I disappear, I will come back very, very shortly. So I'll share my screen. Perfect. Okay. And then do the very awkward start slideshow that everyone has to watch. There we go. Okay, perfect. So this morning, what I primarily wanted to focus on is thinking about ethics and considerations around Indigenous OERs and how we can start to develop localized frameworks around Indigenous open educational resources, and how we can work locally with communities and start to think critically about our own practices when developing these resources. So just to get started off, I think it's always important when we're meeting each other for the first time to kind of position and locate ourselves so that we can understand our own biases and where we're coming from, especially for this conversation, since there is, similarities between Indigenous issues and cultures and worldviews across Canada and the United States. But to kind of think about the biases that we have here in Canada, the biases that are in the United States, but also some of the similarities. And given the context of this presentation, I will mostly be kind of pulling information that is primarily Canadian focus around Canadian laws and Canadian understandings of relationships with Indigenous folks. But as we go forward, kind of bringing in your own understanding from your local context in Arizona and beyond, from other areas that you might be in, when thinking about your relationships with Indigenous people, your relationships with local community, as well as federal policy or laws that might be impacting cultural protection, knowledge protection, and how that fits into an educational context. So when we locate and position ourselves, it helps us to kind of recognize where we're coming from. It helps us to build relationships with one another and forms a type of cultural resistance. So when we locate and position ourselves, we can ask questions like, who are your kin? What lands are you connected from? Or where are you from? So when we say back home in Treaty 6 territory, we say Tanta Kiewao, which means like, where are you from? But not necessarily like the land. It is tied to the land, but more it has a meaning like, who is your kin? So where is your umbilical cord connected to? That's kind of what it translates to. When we position ourselves and locate ourselves, we can ask who we're accountable to. And so who we're accountable to within our family, within our home communities, as well as who we're accountable to right now within our job and beyond, and then thinking about the lands that we reside on. So this helps us to acknowledge our biases, positions, and connections that we have with one another. So just to introduce myself a little bit further, my name's Kayla Lar Son. I'm originally from Treaty 6 territory, so I grew up in an area called Amiskwaci, or the Beaver Hills. I grew up about 45 minutes east of Amiskwaci, Wisconsin, which is colonially known as Edmonton, Alberta. I grew up in a small farming community called Tofield. So if you were kind of thinking geographically where Edmonton and Topfield are, if you're not familiar with kind of Canadian geography, I grew up about 8 hours north of Glacier National Park. So that's about my closest to figure out from. So about 8 hours north of the Montana border is where I'm from. So quite far. My mom is Métis and I'm a citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta and also a traditional harvester for my nation. My dad's Ukrainian settler, and my mom and dad are all kind of from that north central Alberta, as well as where I grew up. So when we're thinking also about Indigenous folks within a Canadian context, there's three legally identified groups within Canada. That's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And that's under Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982 of Canada. And we'll talk about that in a little bit later and how that kind of fits into knowledge protection within a Canadian context. So I am a recognized Indigenous person within Canada. So in about 2020, I did move out to Vancouver, though. So I am located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam people. So out here, I am currently actually joining you from my office on the UBC Vancouver campus. And I'm very happy to be here today. And I'm very happy to be working very closely with Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations on OER initiatives and how we move forward. That's a little bit about me. And this is actually a picture of kind of not too far from where I grew up. So very different than the coast. If you think about the coast, it's a lot like Seattle, kind of Portland area, a lot more mountains around here. But I grew up very much in the flatlands, the prairies, and now I'm out here. So, as it was introduced, I am the acting head of the Keynote Library here on campus, and I'm also the Indigenous Programs and Services Librarian for UBC Libraries. So, my role as the Indigenous Programs and Services Librarian was to originally support the Indigitization program, which worked with BC First Nations communities for about 13 years to be able to support them and uplift them in digitizing their own cultural heritage in a way that aligned with their own protocols and practices and uplifted folks for kind of being able to enter into the GLAM sector, so galleries, libraries, archives, and museums within British Columbia without going through necessarily formal education like an undergraduate degree, master's degree, or another type of professional program that might be offered. And this was very much so a hands-on learning experience for communities where we would run workshops and then they would learn how to do digitization of photographs, oral histories, video recordings, things like that. So it had a very large expanse. I stepped back from that program to be able to support the branch in kind of more of the administrative aspect of the branch and making sure that Huihua remains kind of a center for uplifting Indigenous research, uplifting Indigenous librarians, and also uplifting Indigenous communities. So for example, today, actually right after this, I have to head out because we're working for Hobier. So happy Hobier, everyone. It's the start of Nishka New Year out here in Coast Salish territory. So it's a big event that happens every year, and it's pretty much marking the running of the Ulakin fish. And Ulakin is really important for a lot of communities for food as well as grease. So it's big ceremony event, cultural performances, and our library has a branch handing out borrower cards for communities. So Huihua Library is very important, and the work that we do out of Huihua is very important for Indigenous communities and beyond. So our branch is the only Indigenous focused academic library in all of Canada. So kind of comparable to our branch is the Labriola National American Indian Data Center at ASU, and Alex Soto, who is at ASU and within the center, is actually a very good friend of Huihua. So Huihua and Labriola actually opened around the same time as each other as well. So our branch is all about uplifting Indigenous created resources, curriculum materials, print material. We have a small archive special collection, and our branch has been here since 1993. However, our collection predates that and goes to about the 1970s. We're known as a leader in supporting Indigenous research on campus and beyond. Our librarians focus on everything from metadata to critical Indigenous studies, critical literacy studies, so looking at print material and how to use outdated print material in teaching materials, data sovereignty, AI. AI is kind of a new thing that we've been doing a lot of work with and presenting on here at the branch, and of course supporting open education resources as well as community programming. We incorporate Indigenous perspectives into all aspects of our branch. So as I was mentioning earlier, I'm in a kukuli. So our architecture is a interior Salish contemporary kukuli design. So we're underground in a pit house. Our name Huichwa was gifted to us by Squamish Nation. I'm sorry. And it means to echo, and it was gifted to us by the nation, as well as we are internationally, nationally, and locally known for our subject headings and classification system. So Huichwa Library doesn't use Dewey or Library of Congress. We use an adaptation of the Brian Deere classification system, and we've been using that since our branch became kind of a more formalized branch in the 1980s. And so because of that, we have a Indigenous metadata librarian, Taya Jardine, who is Mi'kmaq from Nottawaganeg First Nation in Mi'kma'ki, so out on the Atlantic coast, and is one of the only Indigenous metadata librarians in all of Canada. So at the branch, and I think this all kind of trickles into OERs and our perception of OERs and how we work with them, is we support what's known as Indigenous librarianship. So one of the important things about Indigenous librarianship is it can be practiced by Indigenous people and by non-Indigenous folks. However, here at the branch, we really are trying to uplift Indigenous librarians and supporting new professionals coming in as well as already graduated professionals. So all of our librarians here at the branch are Indigenous. So myself from Treaty 6, Taya from Mi'kma'ki, and then we have Carlene Delorier-Lyle, who's our information services librarian and is Ojibwe, Cree, and Anishinaabe from Manitoba and Ontario area, and is a member of Burns River First Nation and Lac Seul First Nation, and has connections to Lac Seul. So we have many librarians who are Indigenous working here in the branch, as well as are married into communities here on the coast as well. So including married into Musqueam, which is the lands that we're located on. So this is important for us to also have Indigenous librarians working in the space, because within a Canadian context, there's only about 30 of us, a few more that are just about to graduate, who are Indigenous identifying and have a Master's of Library and Information Sciences. So it really is underrepresented of having Indigenous people in this field working within Indigenous libraries, working within other libraries that have a master's degree. There's a lot more folks who are Indigenous identifying that have a LibTech diploma, but a lack of folks with the master's degree, and one person that's just about to graduate with a PhD. So still really underrepresented. Also underrepresented in the United States as well. So within kind of the context of Indigenous folks, there really are not a lot of us working within these fields. This is mostly due because of, well, here within a Canadian context, it would have been enfranchisement policies, which went until mid-1950s, which meant that Indigenous folks could not go to university without losing their status. As well, Indigenous women would lose their status if they married men, if you joined the army or the service, as well as if you went to university. So these are kind of policies that happened which really enabled Indigenous folks into moving into academic spheres. So what Indigenous librarianship does, though, is it unites the discipline of librarianship with Indigenous approaches to knowledge, theory, and research methodology. So a focus of Indigenous librarianship is the provision of culturally relevant library and information services, collections by, for, and with Indigenous people. And also what it is it's grounded in the contemporary realities of Indigenous people and Indigenous aspirations of self-governance and sovereignty. And I really should take out the aspirations, because Indigenous people have been asserting their own self-governance and sovereignty for a very long time within Canada. It's something that's never stopped. So even within these enfranchisement policies that we had here in Canada, so such things as ceremonial bans. So until mid-1950s, we had the potlatch ban. So communities could not come together in ceremony here in Canada. Sweat lodges, sun dances, ghost dances were not allowed to be practiced across Canada, as well as Indigenous folks were not allowed to have their own self-governance, so traditional chiefs, hereditary chiefs, clan groups, and also we were not allowed to participate in federal or provincial or municipal voting until about the 1970s. So really, but we have, as Indigenous folks across Canada, have been practicing and underground and in our own ways and uplifting things like hereditary chiefdoms for many years, even though folks had originally tried to stop this. So one thing, considering that we're coming from kind of academic context, academic backgrounds, and talking about OER, I think it's important to kind of start off looking at why there is such a complexity within academia, especially with Indigenous knowledges, and how this still continues on into thinking about more modern kind of expansion of academia, thinking about OERs, thinking about AI, and some of these considerations that still kind of trickle down throughout the years into practices that can be very problematic for Indigenous communities and also other marginalized communities. So when we're thinking about Western knowledge, educational institutions are guided by Western bias. They transformed the plurality of knowledge systems into a hierarchy of knowledge systems. Indigenous systems of knowledge and knowledge transmission were deemed to be inferior when compared to Western traditions. Western research is constituted by a set of ideas, practices, and privileges that are embedded within imperial expansion and colonization. These ideas, practices, and privileges later become institutionalized by academic disciplines, schools, curriculums, and universities. Under colonial influence of intellectual heritage, non-Western thought was devalued and misinterpreted. Often also within kind of a Western understanding of research, a researcher is put into an arbitrary position of power and given authority over a discipline and subject that they specialize in, even if they're not from that community. It's kind of that Western gaze inside, so that outsider gaze into a community. Also, this has continued on throughout up until within a Canadian context. We didn't have behavioral research ethics that were solidified within universities here until early 2000s. So even, for example, the University of British Columbia's behavioral research ethics, they got their finalized, so for us, it's called the TSPS2, our finalized research ethics forms that have to be compliant with the Tri-Council. So that's our federal funding agencies for research. So that's SSHRC, so Social Sciences, Humanities, and NSHRC, which is the natural sciences, and then also the medical granting agencies. So we didn't have our kind of behavioral research ethics or research with humans solidified until mid 2000s. So thinking about 2011 was the last time that it was reviewed. Behavioral research or ethics within a Canadian context, we don't really even see that until mid 90s talk about it. So for a very long time, there's been continuation of problematic practices within research. And we see this to this day, even in 2025. We see sometimes problematic research practices that trickle down and need to be dealt with in different levels. So some of these practices include that the majority of Indigenous focused research projects are being conducted by non-Indigenous people. Researchers tend to select subjects and projects that are based on personal interest that leads to communities being inundated with research requests that do not benefit a community in a direct way or leads to irrelevant research and data outputs coming from that research. There are sometimes a lack of informed consent due to language barriers within communities. There still are very much so communities here in Canada that their traditional languages might be their first language and not English or French being their first language. Mainly in more northern, rural, and remote communities, we find that. And then also research is not returned to the community or is not disseminated within a way that it is barrier-free for communities or in more of plain language that is understandable by Indigenous community members. And in addition to this, we still see the continued utmost disrespect and disregard by non-Indigenous researchers for traditional knowledges, stories, ceremonies, and also ancestral remains of Indigenous people within Canada. So within a Canadian context, we do not have NAGPRA. We do not have any type of formalized legality about the return of ancestral objects or remains to communities. Communities can go through repatriation processes with GLAM institutions to be able to repatriate, rematriate, and have the return of their community objects, ancestors, stories, and ceremonies. But it's up to the institution and the institution's own ethics, I guess you could say, around and how they want to partner with communities on returning these items. So Indigenous research and theory. So when we see kind of the advent of Indigenous people moving into academic spheres, moving into libraries, moving into being professors, to being sessional instructors, and being actively participating in the institution is when we kind of see this shift towards ideas around Indigenous research, as well as shifts in policies and practices within institutions. So, and all of this kind of sets up very much so a foundation for talking about Indigenous OERs and Indigenous knowledges in OERs when we begin to learn about Indigenous research and how Indigenous folks share their own stories, knowledges, etc. So this is why I'm leading off with a very intro to Indigenous research methods and methodologies. So Indigenous research emerges from the incorporation of Indigenous lived experiences, language, and worldviews into the research process and centers Indigenous peoples and communities as the researcher and primary authority on a subject or topic. Indigenous research is accountable, reciprocal, and means that it integrates the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional aspects of knowledge gathering and sharing. As well, Indigenous research methodologies follow the same trajectory as Indigenous research methods, and they dismiss colonial understandings of the research process and incorporate the use of techniques and methods withdrawn from traditions and knowledges of the people. Research by, for, and with Indigenous people using techniques, methods drawn from the tradition. So that is pretty much what Indigenous-led research is. And a lot of thinking about Indigenous-led OERs follows this, reciprocal, accountable, and it also incorporates the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual aspects of knowledge gathering and sharing. So Indigenous knowledges as well. Indigenous peoples, we do not put our knowledges systems into binaries. The world can be very subjective, and also there are 5 characteristics of Indigenous ways of knowing. So Indigenous knowledges in general are personal, orally transmitted with exception. There definitely, most certainly, definitely are exception, but often we'll find communities sharing stories and passing them down intergenerationally through oral traditions. Experiential. So I can show you a picture of what it looks like where I grew up, but unless you're actually standing in that field and you're feeling the wind, you're smelling the sweet grass, you're hearing the geese honking, you don't actually know what it's like to be in Tofield, Alberta. Holistic and also narrative. So Indigenous knowledges are also experienced and transmitted intergenerationally within kin, community, and also through ceremonial practices. So Indigenous worldviews are also holistic and cyclical and dependent on relationships between living and non-living entities. There are many truths, and these truths are dependent upon individual experiences. Everything is alive. Everything is equal. The land is sacred. The relationship between people and the spiritual world is important, and humans sometimes are the least important being in the world. And also, Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous worldviews bring in relationality. And I think relationality is really an important concept and an important way of living when it comes to things like open educational resources and how we think about knowledge and how we think, even within a library context, about print materials. So, relationality within Western research, it portrays a hierarchy where humans are placed at the top of the pyramid and all other life forces that came into existence are done so to serve humans. Indigenous relationality is how we connect to our human and more than human relations. We're embedded within Indigenous knowledge systems and laws. Relationality also is the ability to transcend between the physical and the spiritual worlds and connect to our ancestors and those who have not been born, and also creator beings. Within a relationality concept as well, we bring it into the branch here and into our professional practices as Indigenous librarians, because often we see things like our archives, photographs, print materials as not just being these physical materials that are not alive, but as alive things, as items that are connected to communities and to kin to communities. I have one of my colleagues who's an archaeologist that says like physical objects, octopus bags, masks also have a life force. They're connected to communities, they're connected to people. So, for example, to this, so some of the masks that are worn, like the haha masks, which are like raven masks that are brought out in ceremony here, are, and I'm allowed to share this as well, is that the masks, when they are at a museum or not within community, or even when they are within community, are tied. The beaks are tied because they are connected directly to the person that wears them. So that's why we tie the mouth, or else there's that connection. So we are connected to objects in different ways. And it's important to think about what that means in a digital space, how we're connected to these stories, how we're connected to items within a digital space. And I think there is a book called A Digital Bundle by Jennifer Wagamamis, I think is her last name. And I would definitely, if folks are interested in kind of this idea of relationality and bringing in kin and data sovereignty into digital spaces, that's a really good book to read to kind of further understand that connection. So also thinking about knowledge transfer, this is where it starts to get a little bit tricky, and this is really important when we're thinking about Indigenous open educational resources and how things are being, how knowledge is being transferred to one person to another. So when we're thinking about Indigenous knowledge is transferred, for most Indigenous communities, knowledge is not freely given, it's earned, and it's earned in different ways. So if we think about folks that are in academia, you go to class, your professor gives a lecture, you write down, or I guess this is me sounding old, you write down your notes. You don't, you can type your notes now on a computer. And that is kind of what students learn. That's what we're taught in K to 12. But traditionally, when I go to my elders, when I'm going even to elders here, not back home, but when I'm going to elders out here on the coast and I'm asking about traditions, I'm learning about different techniques of doing things like skinning salmon or smoking salmon, or when we go back home, when we work with deer or picking berries or making medicines. There is a transfer of either ceremonial items, so thinking about like tobacco, sweetgrass, money. There is a transfer to be able to earn that knowledge between folks. So often these transfers of knowledge are also informed by legal systems and traditions and protocols, as well as there are most certainly things out here on the coast that I will never know and I'll never see because I'm not part of that community. So sometimes when we're learning and when we're participating in kind of learning activities, you have to be invited in. So definitely, I have been invited into some things out here on the coast, but this is not my own community, and it's not for me to see some of these ceremonies or know some of these things out here in Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and beyond. Protocols can vary from community to community, but generally are informed by the following factors. So they can be informed by kin relationships, such as clan systems and familial relationships, gender specific. So there definitely within some communities out here are stories or narratives that are only, or masks or other items that are only allowed to be held by men, women, or those that are in between. So our two-spirit kin, our indigiqueer folks. So gender specific. Age specific as well. So we go in my community from being an escapeo, which is like an elder helper, to an elder later on in life. And we're always learning. I think it's funny sometimes within academia when folks are like, well, you're an expert. And I don't think anyone's ever an expert. We get called functional experts here at the branch, but I think we're always learning. So we're never an expert in anything because we're constantly learning. And throughout our lives, we're just constantly in a phase of learning and unlearning, which I think is really special and unique. Our knowledges are tied to our land, so geographically influenced. So definitely the knowledges from Treaty 6 territory are different than the knowledges out here on the coast. The prairies are different from the mountains and the ocean, definitely, and our knowledges are reflective of that. As well as seasonal. So there are, right now, we're in the time of ceremony and storytelling. Back home, there's stories that are only allowed to be told when there's snow on the ground, which is a lot of time during the year. But it's funny being out here on the coast because it rarely snows in Vancouver. So I look towards the mountains and I'm always like, okay, can I tell this story? Is there snow on the mountaintops? Which they don't always have snow on them. So definitely different being in the coast. But so seasonally tied, and then also informed by specific techniques or modes of production. So out of this, we have seen, and thinking about knowledges and thinking about Indigenous worldviews coming into academia, there most certainly have been Indigenous frameworks and pedagogies that have come out that we've even been able to look at, that have been able to inform how we develop frameworks and pedagogies for Indigenous OERs, or when communities are thinking about OERs or research projects, that they can bring in their own scope and worldview to inform it. So I've just given you some examples of some. A lot of these are very localized, and I know that there's also frameworks and pedagogies that come out of the United States. So story work from Dr. Joanne Archibald brings in 7 principles of how to bring in stories into an educational context. So thinking about respect, responsibility, reciprocity, reverence, holism, interrelatedness, and also synergy. So this is how we bring stories into education. So thinking for Joanne's work, it's K-12 education. A big one that often I hear about is two-eyed seeing, which is brought in by Elder Albert Marshall, who's Mi'kmaq. And it's a theoretical philosophical and methodological approach that recognizes the need for both Western and Indigenous paradigms. So often, even within my own, when I was tenured here at the university, when I went up for it, one of the things that was brought up is that a lot of us here at the branch, including myself, practice a two-eyed seeing approach. So being able to understand those really institutional policies in academia, and even thinking, incorporating Indigenous worldviews and approaches. So even thinking about a two-eyed seeing approach when we're talking about things like open educational resources. So how can we bring in that very technological aspect, or kind of the Western understanding of an OER, or a traditional understanding of an OER, while also including the Indigenous approach to it. So that two-eyed seeing approach. And then Elder Brother teachings teaches about our kin roles and responsibilities that we have. When we're thinking about Indigenous methods, this is when it gets really, really interesting. And I've been doing a lot of work about thinking about Indigenous methods and how, when we're thinking about Indigenous methods, which in a digital context, how they can be incorporated into very localized OERs to kind of reimagine the structure and the building of an OER to reflect a community's own understandings. So thinking about like Karina Sparrow from Musqueam, reclaiming spaces, Coast Salish two-spirit identities and experiences. But Karina's thesis and the example given within their thesis is thinking about the 4 house posts within a longhouse and how that connects to reclaiming spaces and identities. thinking about, since we're coming into the Ulican harvest, thinking about traditional stories. And the example given is the Ulican harvest and how traditional stories come out through the Ulican harvest. And this was part of her thesis, as well as things like ancestral tattoo revivals and bringing in tattoo practicing into academia and thinking about how that kind of transfers in knowledge transfer and understanding as a traditional learning method. So really, how can we kind of incorporate Indigenous methods and understandings into digital spaces? So data, okay, this is where it's going to get really interesting. And this is where the narrative kind of shifts a lot when it comes to OERs and thinking about what we're putting into open educational resources. So for me, Indigenous data means a lot of different things. Sometimes when I give talks, folks are like, oh, Indigenous data, you mean stories. But Indigenous data goes very much so beyond that. So in general, we can kind of break down what Indigenous data is into three kind of subsets. So Indigenous data, and this data is often used in OERs as well. So Indigenous data can be data on Indigenous resources, environment. So this is our land data, titles, water information, things like that. Data about Indigenous demographics or social data. So often this could be like census, health, legal data, education, and then data from communities. So traditional cultural data, archives, oral histories, ancestral knowledges, things like that. One thing as well, though, is like we have community from data, which seems very much more traditional cultural. We also have community that comes from data that is more of that legal health and educational data. So sometimes communities do their own censuses, they do their own surveys internally on health data, things like that. So it kind of spans across. Some of it is more federally focused, provincially for us, provincially or state focused, community focused, but it can also kind of bop around between the three depending on who's doing the survey, who's collecting that data. And then we can break it down also into different types. So these different types of data are found within those other three data sets. And this is kind of our Indigenous knowledges. So first of all, we have traditional knowledges, we have biocultural resources, and then Indigenous cultural expressions. So our traditional knowledges are going to be knowledges that are passed down within communities, knowledges that kind of form the tradition behind communities, the culture, the language, the governance structures, things like that. Biocultural resources are going to be information like plant data, blood sampling, biodata, anything like that. And then Indigenous cultural expressions are going to be things that are more tangible items. So like songs, dances, physical materials like masks, button blankets, headdresses, things like that. And with the sharing of or with data, there becomes Indigenous data protocols, and these form how items are shared between individuals or communities. So Indigenous data protocols are different from community to community and are often informed by their own communities' laws or understandings and governance structures. So some of these protocols that we see are things like ownership and inheritance. And this can be done at a community, not usually at an individual level, but mostly at a community, clan, and at a family level. So data protocols also include that your information or your knowledge needs to be earned. It can be reflected by age. So often, like I said, young elder helpers learn a lot less, and the knowledge is transmitted in different ways. Gender identity, geography, and season. Much like also the protocols around storytelling. There are the same protocols for the sharing of data, not just traditional knowledges and stories. Okay, so how does this all transfer into open educational resources and getting into that? So OERs. So we've been talking about OERs, or hopefully for the last couple of days, folks have been talking about OERs and what they are, but just to cover our bases so that we're all kind of on the same understanding of what an OER is, they are teaching, learning, and research resources that are created with the intention of being freely available to users. They may include, but are not limited to, textbooks, readings, multimedia files, and courses. Most are covered by licenses that allow for the using, remixing, and sharing of these resources. And they break down barriers for authors when it comes to publishing. Due to also their openness, paywall barriers are often elevated. And I think also within OERs, one thing that I didn't add to this is often OERs and the publishing platforms for them, so such as like Pressbooks, things like that, they're fairly easy to understand and to use and to create as well. So there is a bit of a technology barrier also compared to some other platforms that I've seen that definitely you have to have some type of basic understanding of coding or website design or also monetary funds to be able to, even if it is open source code, so thinking about content management systems, so not necessarily for education, but more for like cultural or community collections, but those content management systems or CMSs can be quite, even if they're open source, they can need quite a bit of financial help to be able to get them to a state where they are fully functional for communities to be able to use. So when we're thinking about OERs, most folks know about the 5 R's of OERs. So that's retain, so the right to make, own, and control copies of content. Reuse, so the right to use content in a wide variety of ways. Revise, so the right to adapt, adjust, and modify and control the content. Remix, so the right to combine the original and revised content and redistribute. And so that's the right to share your copies of the original content, your revisions, and your remixes. So when we're thinking about Indigenous OERs, though, this does not necessarily work. So thinking about all the things that I just talked about with Indigenous data protocols, Indigenous knowledge transfer, and the nuances behind how we work within our own communities of sharing information, we can be really critical of the 5 R's of OERs and thinking about how they help or how they hinder communities. And so this is kind of a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years when it comes to OERs and advocating for Indigenous knowledges in OERs or advocating for not having Indigenous content in OERs. I think it goes 2 different ways. So one of the things that we look at when we're looking at that advocacy and we're thinking critically about like practices such as or frameworks such as the 5 R's of OERs is we can bring in concepts of community sovereignty and legal ease to be able to support our advocacy and to be able to understand what can be shared and what can't be shared. So here's where we get very Canadian for a second. So I invite you to think about more within the United States. And if there are folks from Canada on this webinar, you might also, or this Zoom call, you might be very familiar with this. But for folks who very much so are in the United States, definitely think about your own federal and state laws that might be able to impact the sovereignty of Indigenous people for the good or the bad also, because it is very complex when we're talking about Indigenous governance and relationships with state entities. So within a Canadian context, the Government of Canada recognizes that Indigenous people have the inherent right to self-government and determination. And this is in Section 35 of our Constitution Act of 1982. And this covers First Nations, Métis, and Inuit folks. So the recognition of inherent right is based on the view that Indigenous people within Canada have the right to govern themselves in relation to matters that are internal to their communities, integral to their own unique cultures, identities, traditions, languages, and institutions with respect to their special relationship to land and resources. So within a Canadian context and with a larger context, but within Canadian specifically, when we compare Canadian laws, which are primarily under British common law, that dictate ownership and knowledge rights, such as the Canadian Copyright Act, it is clear that Indigenous aspirations of self-governance and these laws completely compete with each other, specifically when it comes to traditional knowledges and the protection of traditional knowledges. It's a lot easier to protect a tangible physical item, so such thing as like a mask, an amouti, a bonnet, any type of kind of physical object under copyright law than it is a traditional knowledge. So when we're thinking about these complexities, so issues of protection of Indigenous knowledges arise due to traditional knowledge not qualifying for protection, mainly because within the Canadian context, they're too old and therefore within the public domain. The author of the material is not identifiable, and so there is no rights holder in the traditional sense. And traditional knowledges are owned collectively by Indigenous communities for cultural claims and not by individuals or corporations for economic claims. So even right now, when we're doing a lot of teaching and learning with communities, so First Nations, Métis, Inuit here about what does this mean for AI, for example, we're having to do a lot of advocacy that says like, don't share your traditional stories within things like generative AI, so such as Chat GPT, because then the algorithm starts to learn and it becomes part of the public domain. So we have to be very careful about what we're sharing, specifically when it comes to sacred and traditional knowledges. Not all knowledges are sacred or traditional that are not allowed to be shared. There definitely are knowledges, but further concern is sometimes, we pull out a narrative maybe out of a published print material that the community did not consent to use, which definitely happens. We have some of those items here at the branch that we keep in dark storage in the back. So it's more like when we're pulling items, we're pulling stories without that might be without consent of community, were gathered. So within the Canadian context, the Copyright Act has allowed for the legalized theft of Indigenous knowledges through the guise of Western understandings of ownership and intellectual property. So one of the things that we can fall back on, and I think this is just good practice, it's not necessarily like legalese, but it's a good practice to think about when we are creating any type of digital content or we're sharing any type of Indigenous knowledges research digitally, is to bring in the concept of data sovereignty. So data sovereignty is unique to the 21st century, caused by the increase of data being available online, and it simply implies that it is a means for managing information that is consistent with the laws, practices, and customs of the nation state in which it is located. Indigenous data sovereignty is fairly similar. So Indigenous data sovereignty centers Indigenous peoples' collective rights to data about their peoples, territories, lifeways, cultural heritage, and natural resources, and supported by Indigenous peoples' inherent rights to self-determination and governance. It puts forward the following principles. So Indigenous nations have the right to ownership and governance about data about them, regardless of where it is held or who holds it. Indigenous nations have the right to govern data in a way that aligns with their own data protocols and laws. And Indigenous peoples also have the right to access data that supports nation rebuilding. This often includes things like government documentation, historic and contemporary documentation as well. And all of this supports cultural sovereignty. So cultural sovereignty is essential to the survival of Indigenous nations and cultures. And I've just pulled this quote from Marley, which is a Marley 2020, and this is a journal article about cultural sovereignty for Indigenous folks. Indigenous sovereignty is threatened when cultural sovereignty is violated through exploitation, theft, and misrepresentation of culture, especially through qualitative data. So taken all of this kind of information about knowledge transfer, OER, sovereignty. So thinking now about Indigenous content Indigenous content considerations in OERs. So OERs can be very important to reconciliation. So within a Canadian context, we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which came out around residential schools for folks here within Canada. And now we are in the 60 Scoop and MMIWG, so Missing Murder Indigenous Women Two-Spirit Plus commissions, where we're looking very critically at how we can support building trust back up with communities and building relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks. Specifically within the TRC's call to action, there has been set out for us that there is a responsibility to further learning about histories, contemporary realities, and Indigenous topics, and advocating for the truth also about histories and what has happened to Indigenous peoples here in Canada. And OERs have the potential to create a collaborative and low barrier educational resource for the larger public that upholds Indigenous sovereignty through community consultation, while also building better Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations. So in addition, Indigenous peoples can benefit from the creation of OER through the creation of community-based resources that are focused on language, cultural revitalization initiatives, and also curriculum materials that supports culturally relevant K-12 materials for Indigenous students as well. So there's kind of two sides to OERs that we can see. We can see OERs that are created for more of education for the general public, and this should be done with consultation and collaboration with Indigenous communities. And then we also see OERs for community. So there's kind of two different OERs that we're talking about, or when we're talking about Indigenous open educational resources. So what is an OER or Indigenous OER? So like I said, there's the community created and ones with Indigenous content. However, I think we can be really critical about this. I was at OE Global giving a presentation similar to this, and during one of the kind of question period, someone stood up and said, well, there's a lot of considerations around the sharing of Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous knowledge transfer, and also building those collaborations with communities. So can we really call them an open educational resource? And should we call them an open educational resource, or is it just an Indigenous educational resource? And I think that's really interesting. And especially when I went home and I was talking to elders, and in my community, we don't really have a word for open within this context. So within that kind of like just anyone can share the information, we don't really have a word in the Hiowayan or Cree or in Méchif even that describes this. And I don't believe that in Hunkaminam, Halkamelam, or in Squamish Snitcham, they do either, because I've been asking elders here. So how can we call something an open educational resource when within our own languages, we don't have a way of describing this? Because it's not necessarily a concept that we have that just any information is freely given, right? Or access to that information is freely given. So I think it's really important that when we do make OERs, whether they're for community or for, broader educational use, that we let Indigenous people take the lead. So this can even be when we're having these conversations about OERs, or we're deciding to create platforms and repositories for OERs, or we're developing OERs for courses and content, that we consult with communities when appropriate, and that we consult with the right communities, right? So consult with the community and let them take the lead. Build capacity with communities to create OERs at all steps. So if we have the ability to help communities in creating their own OERs, we should definitely be supporting that. And all of this allows us to build relationships with folks. So building relationship with maybe Indigenous centers within your institution, with local communities, with those beyond, or even with groups that are advocating for better data practices, such as GITA or OCAP, so the First Nations Information Governance Collection. So all these kind of organizations that are concerned about the appropriate sharing of Indigenous knowledges. And then we can also ask ourselves, when we're looking at Indigenous OERs, who is the audience? So I think this will help to drive the creation of the OER and be able to determine how much consultation we need, who do we need to be consulting with, etc. So are we looking at, an OER for communities specifically that communities are going to be creating? So a language revitalization, or is this for the public? Is this a government OER? Is this for education, for academia? Is this K-12 education? So what is the age range? Also, what is the educational level of folks that are going to be using this OER? Is this an OER that's going to be used for a fourth-year anthropology class? Is this an OER that's going to be used for kindergarten kids? Is this an OER that's going to be used for children that are in maybe a multi-graded classroom? So even teacher education or teacher candidates. So are they going to be teaching in a rural area where they might have classes that are like grade 9 to 11 all in the same room? And that is a reality for some folks on rural and reserve communities out here. Thinking about the localized context as well. Is the OER talking about very much so one community? Are we talking about a global level? Are we talking about a national level, international, etc.? Then the context and content. So what is the knowledge being shared? Is this something that, is widely known within a localized context? Is this something that communities have given permission to share? Is this just very basic historical knowledge? Or is this unfortunately, a sacred knowledge that maybe wasn't supposed to be shared? Are there any protocols that need to be adhered to? So how can an OER platform maybe follow some of those protocols around stories that are allowed to be shared, but only allowed to be shared in the winter? Are we able to take an OER platform such as Pressbooks and make it in a way that only that story shared in the winter time? So how does that look? I know there are CMSs that such as Mercadoo that allow for that to happen, but how does this translate into an OER platform? What does consent look like from the community? And then also, is this primary or secondary information? So is this an elder directly telling the story and it's being transcribed and added into a OER and that's allowed to happen? Or is this information that's been pulled from like an early ethnography from like the 1800s where we don't know what the consent looked like behind that? How can we support this, and what is the role of the librarian as the educator? Where do we need to come in and where can we take a step back? So here's some kind of frameworks that I looked at even when looking at our local understandings. So when trying to think about more within a UBC context and how we can do better with our OERs, I looked at the frameworks of the 4 R's of education by Kirkness and Barnhart, and then also the 4 R's of the Longhouse. And out of this, what I was able to do to advance our open education resource, and this is very much so work that's still being worked on. I don't think any of us have the answers around OER, but I created the 5 R's of Indigenous OERs, and we're constantly building upon this work and revising it just so that it actually works within community consultation. So it's respect for Indigenous cultural identities within OERs, building relationships, so bringing in the concept of all relations while also talking to community, responsibility to only share what we're allowed to share and publish in an ethical way while considering ownership, protocols, and practices, reverence. So this is actually the respect for the sacred. So this is the respect for those traditional stories within a community. Relevance, so legitimizing and incorporating Indigenous knowledges into curriculum when it makes sense. And then reciprocity, giving back. So we're almost done. So where do we go from here? As I said, this work is very much so ongoing. I don't think anyone has a straight answer when it comes to Indigenous OERs and how to do them. Very much so right now, the work is either on a very national scale or an international scale, or it's very localized. So from where do we go from here? I think it's important to incorporate Indigenous pedagogies while working with communities. So thinking about how we can do that better. What is the role of education and what is the role of it in Indigenous education primarily? So one of the other R's that I was thinking of is reflection. Where can we bring reflection into this? How do we adapt OER technologies to adhere to the protocols that we need and kind of the growing movement of OERs? And then how do we advocate for Indigenous controlled OERs and funding for this? I think funding for some of these projects is highly important, but it's hard to get. In a Canadian context, hard to get funding for projects. I'm sure in an American context, also hard to get funding for projects, but not impossible. We're moving forward. So ending off, another quote about the concept of open being great for everyone. It's not a good fit for Indigenous knowledge sovereignty. However, I think that we can definitely create OERs in a way that benefit community, that we can build relationships upon, but also we can build OERs that are for community where maybe those knowledges are allowed to be shared. There's many different ways that this can go, and I'm very excited to see kind of what the future of OERs hold and where we go from here. So thank you. Ekose Kinitsmatwin, which means thank you in Cree. And I know we have a follow-up session, so I have a little bit more for the follow-up, but thank you for listening. And I hope that wasn't too much for folks on a very early in the morning. It's a lot about legalese, tradition, things like that. But
well, no, thank you so much. It was very informative, and I think it gives us a lot to think about when we're engaging with students and colleagues and our communities, local communities, and thinking about ways to collaborate as well. Before we move on, we do have a few minutes left over in case there are any questions. So if you do have any kind of questions or whatever, as Kayla mentioned, there is a follow-up session that you can join to get a little bit more about it. But if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And in the absence of questions, it looks like there's just some thank yous in there. So great job. Thank you so much for joining us, of course. So one thing, I guess then we'll just go ahead and move, transition on. So thank you again. We're going to take a short break prior to the start of the breakout sessions for today, including the follow-up session with Kayla Lar Son. We have breakout sessions throughout the day. There's workshops. There's a panel after lunch. There's a group of open education leaders discussing OER as a transformational tool for social justice. So don't miss that. And then, as was mentioned prior to the keynote address, we have our OER award celebration today at 3:55. So we'll be recognizing some of our Arizona colleagues for the work they've done in OER and open education more broadly. And it's been a pleasure to bring this conference to you and the community together. So enjoy the rest of the sessions and have a great day.